Hey, how is it going? It's Christmas Eve back in 2022, and Dan, a former sergeant who's now working as a teacher, is supposed to be helping his wife Emmy and their daughter Muri with the party preparations. But instead of that, he's on the phone trying to land his absolute dream job at a laboratory. But unfortunately, his application gets rejected. After having a bit of a frustrated outburst outside, Dan joins his daughter on the couch and he reminds her to do what nobody else is really willing to do. The family then settles in to watch this really important soccer game, but the match is suddenly interrupted when a bright cloud of smoke and electricity appears right on the field and people start to walk out of it. These people look just like soldiers, and they're led by Lieutenant Hart, who informs everyone that they've come from the year 2051. An alien species that's known as the White Spikes has invaded Earth, and most of humanity has been completely wiped out. So these soldiers are here to ask people to travel into the future and help them fight in the war. As the months go by, countries from all over the world send as many soldiers as they possibly can, but it just never seems to be enough. The future keeps on asking for more people, and only about a quarter of those who go actually come back. When they eventually run out of trained soldiers, the government starts drafting civilians to join in on the fight. This causes all kinds of riots in the streets, since a lot of people believe they shouldn't be sent off to a war that doesn't directly affect them. Dan keeps on working as a teacher, but his students don't seem very interested in what he has to teach them because they figure there's no point in learning if they're just going to die anyway. The only real exception is Martin, who is completely obsessed with volcanoes and always wants to talk about them, like all the time. Right then, Dan gets a really important message on his cell phone. He's been drafted. Dan heads over to the military facility and he goes through a few tests that confirm he'll be able to fight because he's supposed to be dead within 7 years. Suddenly, he feels this sharp pain in his arm and finds out they've put a metal device on him. They let him know the device is going to track him in the future. After a 7-day mission, the device will automatically bring him back. Afterwards, Dan goes to tell Emmy the news, and she immediately decides that they should just run for it. Dan points out that he can't really get rid of a government tracker, so Emmy begs him to go talk to his dad, who Dan hasn't seen since he was abandoned as a little kid. Swallowing his pride for the sake of his family, Dan goes to see his father, James, to ask for some help, but James just thinks Dan was sent by the government to spy on him, and a big argument starts up. In the end, Dan has to leave with the device still firmly attached to his arm. He goes back home to give the bad news to his family, but he also makes a solid promise that he will come back. The very next day, Dan heads over to the training center, where he makes friends with a scientist named Charlie and with a fighter named Dorian, who is actually heading back for his 3rd tour of duty. They get some basic training, which includes shooting and first aid, before they're given a full explanation of how the time travel technology actually works. The time link is kind of like 2 rafts on a moving river, and the river can only ever move between those 2 specific points. Because of this, they can only ever travel between the years 22 and 2051. Those are the fixed points, and they can't just choose a moment right before the war started. Sometime later, the recruits are just resting in the barracks when, all of a sudden, the alarm starts blaring. It's time to go. The recruits are pretty confused because they were supposed to get 7 days of training, but they're told that the future can't just pick and choose when it needs help. When everyone is gathered up, the time link is activated and a cloud, just like the one that appeared during the soccer game, starts to pull them into the future. They were supposed to be heading to Miami Beach, but back in the control room, something goes terribly wrong with the exit coordinates. The group appears way up in the sky, right above the city, and they fall onto the top of a building, which causes a lot of them to die instantly. The remaining members manage to save themselves because they happen to fall into a swimming pool and just have to swim their way out. The team looks out over the city of Miami and finds it in a state of complete and utter destruction. They don't really know how to proceed, but at that moment, they're contacted by a colonel who informs them that the entire city has been taken over by the White Spikes and that soldiers are coming to bomb it completely. The team's mission is to rescue a group of researchers who are trapped inside a nearby lab. The colonel knows that Dan has military experience, and so he puts him in command of the team. Dan then guides the group through the city, giving them directions on how to move and finding nothing but death and destruction everywhere they look. They eventually find the lab building, and upon entering, they discover a dead alien, so Dorian grabs one of its claws as a trophy. Further inside, they find the research team, but they're all dead as part of a clever alien trap. The colonel tells them to recover all copies of the research and to hurry up, because if there are bodies around, the white spikes will definitely be back and the fighter jets are getting closer. The team scrambles to grab all the necessary items, and then they start heading down the stairs as quietly as they possibly can. However, one of the members hears a noise and, upon looking up, they finally find out what the white spikes actually look like. The alien fires a spike from its tentacles, killing one of them, and the team immediately opens fire. The bullets don't really seem to damage the alien's thick skin, but at least they seem to slow them down as they make their way down the stairs and find an exit corridor. The aliens kill and capture many of the team members along the way, so Dan stays behind to try and defend them. Since his bullets aren't working, he attacks with a fire axe, which also isn't very effective at all. Luckily, Dorian comes to the rescue and kills the creature, teaching the team that the only weak spots are the neck and the belly. With a whole lot of white spikes right behind them, the team runs through the streets until they find the tank that was supposed to rescue them. Unfortunately, the white spikes get to the tank first and completely destroy it. Now the team has absolutely no choice but to fight the aliens head-on while trying to find some kind of shelter. As more and more team members fall to the alien attacks, the survivors fall down into a tunnel and Dan stops to rescue a fallen recruit. This really slows the whole team down, and two of the recruits decide to stay behind and act as a shield against the aliens so that the rest of the team can get away. Just then, the jets finally arrive and bomb the entire area into oblivion. Hours later, Dan and Charlie wake up at a forward operating base located in the Dominican Republic. They find Dorian, who informs them that the rest of the team is dead and chews Dan out for stopping to help one fallen person, which put absolutely everyone else in danger. Dorian then admits that he's suffering from cancer and has learned that he is the one who gets to decide when he's going to die. Their conversation is cut short when Dan is called to see the colonel. When he hears another soldier refer to the colonel by her last name, Dan is completely shocked to realize it's an older Muri. She grew up to become a scientist, and she's the lead researcher for the R-Force, which she actually created herself. Muri explains that she didn't bring Dan here to see him again as a father. She actually needs his help with something important. In fact, she acts very cold and professional around him. Then, she shows him a recording of a white spike with a noticeably different appearance. All of the aliens they faced in the city were males, and this one is a female. She is way more aggressive and much rarer, and she also nests deep underground. The male white spikes would literally die to defend her because it seems like all they care about is the survival of their species. The bombs that the army uses contain a special toxin created by Muri, and so far, it's been killing the male white spikes without any issue. However, the female alien has actually survived this toxin, so Muri needs Dan to join the extraction team and capture a female white spike so it can be studied. Hopefully, they'll be able to develop a much stronger toxin that will kill the alien's main source of reproduction. The team gets ready and takes off in helicopters, where Muri tells Dan the story of what exactly happened. The aliens just showed up out of nowhere in Russia back in 2048, somehow avoiding all satellite and radar surveillance. It only took them 3 years to take over the entire world, and they don't care about material things, they just want humans for food. Dan really wants to know what happened to him before he died, but Muri thinks it's probably best not to go down that particular road. Moments later, they arrive at the nest where they find a group of soldiers trying to tie down the female white spike. The alien is absolutely furious and starts attacking the soldiers, killing many of them in the process. Muri joins in and lands a clean shot right in her neck, giving the others a chance to tie her down even more and keep her from getting away. Finding herself trapped, the female alien lets out a scream to call for her protectors, and soon the whole area is swarming with aliens. As the female tries to attack Muri, Dan rappels down and shoots as many aliens as he can before joining the others in the nest to help save his daughter. Together, the soldiers manage to push the female into the cage and onto a helicopter. But now, the males are trying to attack the helicopters as well to save her, even causing one of them to crash. Dan and Muri rush over to a jeep and they start shooting at the aliens to give the helicopters a chance to escape with the caged female. Afterwards, the two of them drive away at top speed to get out of the area. They stop on a beach to send up an SOS flare, and Muri scolds Dan for acting without thinking. Dan just wants to protect her, but Muri doesn't believe him and explains that he left the family when she was 12 because the depression from not working in his desired field hit him really hard. When she was 16 years old, Dan got into a fatal car accident, and Muri was there at the hospital when he passed away. Muri is deeply hurt by all of this, and Dan is just speechless because he can't believe he became just like his own father. Suddenly, he realizes he can kind of understand James when he said the war left him in a very dark place mentally. The female White Spike is taken to a fortified oil rig way out at sea, which is where the time machine is kept. She is chained up and given a large dose of sedatives every single hour. Dan and Muri then work together analyzing the alien's DNA and trying to figure out just how she stops the toxin from killing her. It's incredibly hard work that takes many long days, but it also allows them to reconnect and talk in a more friendly way while they share their meals together. On the night before Dan is set to leave, he tells Muri that he's so proud of her and that her mother would be incredibly proud as well. Dan tries to tell Muri that she needs to rest and give more tasks to him since he's there to help out. Muri takes this chance to finally explain exactly why she brought him here. Once she finds a way to make a stronger toxin, he needs to take it back to the past in order to mass produce it and have it ready for when the aliens eventually arrive. This is precisely why she's working like crazy to finish it that very night. She absolutely needs to be ready before he leaves. Dan doesn't want to just leave Muri to die, but Muri points out that she called him because he's the only one she knows she can truly trust. At that very moment, the machine finally finishes creating a toxin with 100% effectiveness against a female White Spike. But it's also the exact moment the alien wakes up and calls for its protectors. As a whole bunch of male aliens arrive to attack the rig, Dan thinks they should just kill the female to stop the attack. But Muri points out they only have one sample of the toxin and it could be much more useful back in the past. As the soldiers start to defend the rig as best they can and tons of aliens swarm into the labs, Muri and Dan race across the platform to try and get to the helipad where Dan needs to be for the time jump, which is set to happen in just a few minutes. The two of them shoot plenty of aliens on the way, but Muri still gets hit by a flying spike. Dan tries to help her walk, but she's in a lot of pain and the whole rig is about to collapse because the aliens have crashed a ship right into it. Muri apologizes for being so cold to Dan, and after telling him she loves him, she hands him the toxin, urging him to take it back to save everyone. Suddenly, an alien appears and drags Muri away with it, causing Dan to jump right after her to try and save her. However, it's at that exact moment that the time machine activates and the time link pulls Dan, Dorian, Charlie, and the others right back to the past. Thankfully, the toxin is safe and sound in Dan's hand and the vial doesn't break. Charlie is doing okay, but he confesses that he just hid like a coward the whole time. Dan tells Hart that they need to mass produce the toxin and send it to the future to kill all the aliens, but Hart delivers some terrible news. The time machine isn't working anymore, likely because the aliens on the oil rig destroyed the other end of it. They can never go back, which means it's all over. Dan returns home and can hardly believe he gets to be with his family again, still in complete shock from everything he's been through. At night, he can't seem to sleep and keeps on visiting Muri's room just to confirm that she's still alive. When Emmy comes to check on him, Dan shares what happened with the older Muri, and he's still completely determined to find a solution to all of this. Emmy helps him look at the facts. They know the aliens attack Russia in 2048, but nobody ever sees their ships arrive. Maybe that's the year they start to move, but they actually arrived earlier and nobody noticed because it's in the frozen middle of nowhere in Russia. So they need to start looking at the years before that happened. The very next day, Dan immediately springs into action. He visits Dorian and convinces him that this isn't over yet. Then they take Dorian's trophy claw to the lab where Charlie now works. Charlie confirms there's sediment on the claw that looks a lot like volcanic ash coming from either China or Korea. They don't really understand how Asian ash could end up all the way in Russia, which means they need to ask a volcano expert. Next up, Dan goes to see his student Martin, who explains that there was a massive volcanic eruption in Asia thousands of years ago. If the ash was blown around by the wind, it could have been captured in the Russian waters, which eventually turned into solid ice. This means the creatures have always been here on Earth, just frozen under hundreds of layers of ice, which is why they never saw any ships arrive. The real reason they wake up in 2048 is because that's when climate change finally finishes melting all the polar ice. They take this whole theory to the government, but since they don't have any actual proof, they don't get the resources to go find the alien nest. They'll have to do this illegally, and Dan knows just the right person for that. His father, James, who has been living off the grid for years and has his very own airplane. Hearing Dan say the words, "I need your help," convinces James to help with the mission, no matter how crazy it might sound. Dan also gets in touch with Hart, who worked with Muri in the future and is ready to finish her dear leader's mission. Hart brings a few soldiers with her, along with plenty of weapons and a few copies of the toxin. The team travels all the way to Russia, and Charlie promises that this time he's definitely not going to hide. When they get to the Academy of Sciences glacier, they start to look for any signs of something strange in the area. They stop when they find out their machines are going haywire because of a weird magnetic field all around them. Using a lot of explosives, the team blows a hole in the ground and enters an ancient cavern where they finally find the frozen spaceship. Dan points out that going into the ship is extremely dangerous, and they could just tell the government they found proof. But everyone agrees that the government has been totally useless, and it's up to them to do the right thing. They use a chainsaw to cut through the ice, and the team enters the ship while leaving Charlie and James outside, just in case anything tries to escape. The group makes it to the cockpit and realizes that this is actually a crash site. The aliens never intended for Earth to be their destination. Surprisingly, the pilot's body is not a white spike at all. They enter another room and find the real white spikes inside a series of biopods, which makes them realize they are just cargo. Bioengineered creatures used by the pilot's alien race as weapons to colonize other planets. The team begins to inject the toxin into the pods and watches as the white spikes writhe in pain, confirming that the toxin does in fact kill them. However, their screams also wake up the aliens that haven't been injected yet, causing them to break out of their pods and attack. The team shoots as many as they possibly can, but a few of them manage to escape. Dorian points out they have no choice but to blow up the ship, so he gives his claw to Dan and agrees to stay behind to activate the bomb after everyone else has gotten out. James starts shooting at the escaping aliens, but Charlie's gun jams and he starts killing the creatures with the chainsaw instead. Dan manages to get out and warns everyone to run, while Hart and the others get surrounded by a huge colony of aliens. Unable to wait any longer, Dorian sets off the bomb, taking all the creatures with him and dying on his own terms, just like he always wanted. Dan, Charlie, and James get out of the cave just before the blast hits them, but James explains that he saw an alien with a red belly get away. Dan realizes it must be the female, so they split up to go after her. The queen finds one of them and attacks, but it turns out to be a snowman covered in clothes that James set up as a decoy. When the queen goes after him, Dan shows up to hit her with his snowmobile. Then, father and son start shooting together until they manage to push the queen right off the edge of a cliff. They know she isn't dead yet, and they get ready for her return. When the queen attacks again, she separates them and then fires a spike at Dan before going after him. Dan uses that very same spike to stab her in the mouth, and James uses the chance to hit her with an axe, blinding her. The queen starts to thrash around in desperation, and Dan takes the chance to inject the toxin into her leg. However, the queen just rips that leg off, so the toxin won't spread through her body. When the queen tries to go after Dan, he readies a grenade to take her down with him. But just then, James holds up his injured hand to make the alien smell his blood and come after him instead. Dan refuses to lose his father right after they've reunited, so he jumps on the queen and slashes her neck with Dorian's claw. After hitting her a few more times, he grabs the last vial of toxin and shoves it into her mouth before kicking her off the cliff again. The queen smashes against a large rock and finally dies. The next day, news reports from all over the world report a massive explosion in Russia that killed a bunch of aliens, and the government tries to take all the credit for it. Dan returns home and reunites with his family, finally allowing James to meet his granddaughter. Now they can all work together towards a much better future. Ending like this, The Tomorrow War, a 2021 science fiction and war film, and I'll see you in the next video.